So, all right, we're going to go ahead and get rolling, and if you still need to fill that out, go ahead. I've got some boilerplate stuff up front here. So, welcome to the talk on Christianity and creation. So hopefully you have some curiosity around this topic. I know I did. Just a few years ago, my wife and a dear friend of mine challenged me on a couple of topics in this area, and it really revealed to myself, and I had to come to terms with it, that a lot of my worldview, and I was a Christian, but a lot of my worldview was not based on the Bible. And then I kind of went on a journey, and I know some of you in here have heard that, but I went on a journey and started trying to understand the truth of what a biblical worldview looks like and how I reconcile the evidence that we see in creation with that. So, real quick show of hands, how many of you grew up going to public school? Okay, me too. How many of you grew up in an evangelical church, kind of like City Light? Okay. So I would just say we probably had about 75% public school and maybe 25% evangelical church. Those two things shaped a ton of my worldview and experience. I didn't grow up in an evangelical church, and I did go to public school. And that was like, I'm getting old now, I'm 41, so that was like 25 years ago-ish. And it's evolved quite a bit since then, no pun intended there. So here's some resources. I always put this up front just so we don't miss it. If you guys are interested in diving deeper, like Nate said, I'm probably just a couple YouTube videos and books ahead of some of you. Some of you are probably further than me. So I'm just regurgitating a lot of things I've learned over the years, but I always start with Is Genesis History? It's a 2-hour YouTube video you can watch. It is fantastic. And then there's a whole bunch of follow-up videos they have in there about subdomains and stuff. I'm also not going to be able to answer every flipping question you have today. This is a really broad, diverse topic space, so Nate's going to answer anything I can answer. All right, so to get into it, we're going to get to Q&A, but first I just kind of want to tee up some of this worldview stuff. And the question is, like, how do we get to this, where we see the same evidence? We're looking at this skeletal structure, maybe some fossil remains, and we have two people that come up with wildly different conclusions. One says, hey, that came from a transitional species. We might call that an ape man or something like that, like Lucy. The other one says, hey, that's just a chimpanzee. Completely different conclusions. How does that happen? Well, it happens because conclusions, especially when looking at things in the past, conclusions are completely dependent upon our interpretation. Our interpretation is dependent upon our worldview, and it does bias us. Everybody is biased. You'll hear this out, especially in sort of secular worlds of, hey, let's just come to this neutral ground over here where we're all going to play in this playground called neutral ground. Don't bring your Christianity in. I won't bring my evolutionary, humanism or whatever into that playground. They're all lying. Your line, their line, everybody. Everybody has a worldview. So, at the end of the day, there's really two predominant worldviews. That's one that's based on God's word, based on what is written in the Bible. It's the truths, the standards by which we as Christians live by, that are eternal, absolute, never changing, all the characteristics of God, which gives me a lot of security and confidence that I don't have to worry about a changing, sifting sands kind of worldview. Which brings me to man's worldview, which is very relative. Just, I think last night we were talking about, look in the last 20 years, what has changed in 20 years of time. We've all lived, most of us probably in here, have lived through it. And you can see how it shifts and changes. So that's kind of what secular worldview is built on. And what we find, it's kind of a big, in this space, this topic area that the man's worldview is based on, is a lot of evolutionary thinking. And so what is that? Because I think it's really important to dive into that, because if you're like me, this is what you were taught growing up predominantly. And that it's all about evolutionary thinking, not just biological evolutionary thinking, but geological evolution and cosmological evolution. And really, what is that rooted in? It's rooted in naturalism, that everything has to be explained by natural causes that we see today. And what is that? It's taking the supernatural out of everything. What do we call that? Atheism. That hit me like a ton of bricks. I was like, wait a minute, you're telling me like a lot of my worldview is based on atheism? Like, So here's the naturalistic worldview assumptions that nature or matter is all that exists. There's these three things. We're going to come back to these in your questions likely. That's why I'm teeing them up. Nature and matter, all that exists, nothing else. There's no supernatural. And these three things, everything can be explained by time, chance, and the laws of nature that we observe today at the rate of present processes that we observe today. Okay? So, this is where I was, and where some of you might be, where you're trying to build your Christian worldview on top of secular thinking, secular worldviews, and you may not even know it, but it comes out. And then this is what happens to a lot of folks. Barna Research Group has done a lot of research, and I don't know the exact statistics right now, but it's a crazy high number of how many kids especially that are graduating out of high school and going into colleges, how many of them grow up in evangelical churches even and walk away from the faith in college. And I personally believe a lot of that comes down to they don't have a worldview that's built on God's word. So they're getting answers to their questions. They all have these questions. Missy and I talk a lot that when we used to teach fourth grade kids quest at McLean Bible Church, we used to get crazy questions for fourth graders, like adult questions. And you know, sometimes I had answers, sometimes I didn't, but it really challenged us. We're like, crap, we got to get on our game. And they're going to get those answers. They're going to go to school. They're going to talk to their friends at school. They're going to talk to whoever is influential in their life, and they're going to get answers. We as a church, and especially parents, have to answer. It's not Val's job to answer every question of the kids. It's the parents' job. That's biblical. That's called out to us in the Bible. So we need to do that. And so as we get into this, I want you guys to be thinking about what lens are you looking through the world? Are you looking through the world from God's truth, God's perspective? Is that answered? Have you looked in the Bible for the answer yet? Or are you just leaning back on your presuppositions that you were taught in 7th grade biology class or something like that? That's what I was doing. So let's talk about this guy real quick. Anybody know who he is? Oh, it says it on the screen. I gave it away. All right. Good job, Clinton. So that's Charles Darwin. He came up with an evolutionary biology theory. Guess what he was? A geologist. Did you catch that? He came up with an evolutionary biology theory, but he's a geologist. So, he had those glasses on. When he went to the Galapagos Islands in the 1800s, he observed finches of different sized beaks. But what did he really observe? Did he observe macroevolution, species changing to other species? You know, cats turning into dogs? No, he observed what's called microevolution. We see this all over the place. You guys probably learned this in biology class, actually, through like looking at genetics and just really small things of how you can have little micro changes in the DNA structure. So he observed micro, not macro. So we see that all over. I have a little Boston Terrier. A good friend of mine has a huge Great Dane. They're all dogs. They could actually procreate. If they do, guess what they create? Dogs. They don't create some variant of outside of the dog kind. All right? So obviously his theory was, hey, we're going to start with a single cell. We're going to throw a whole bunch of random mutation in there, natural selection. We'll talk about those things if you have questions. And then the really big one, which is just throw a ton of time in there. Just throw some ambiguous stuff out there. It's just time, and it'll just magic will happen. And then my theory will come true. The reality is, did he observe any of this? Any of it? No. He made the story up based upon his worldview. I know a lot of people have started calling this the evolutionary story, not theory. Because he didn't actually observe any of it. He just created it from his worldview. But we also have a creator that wrote it down and passed it on to us. And so there was an eyewitness at the beginning of time that told us exactly how the world was created, and there is a ton of evidence that's congruent with the biblical worldview. And I want to give you guys that encouragement today. That was one of my fears. And I say that intentionally because you may have those too. I had lots of doubts and fears about, oh man, I'm going to uncover something, and it's going to take me off the Christian train. I'm going to get thrown off the bandwagon, and now I'm going to have all kinds of doubts. My faith actually got more secure after going through this journey, and I'm still on it. But as I go through it, it gets more secure, not less. And much of this stuff that's in our textbooks that we're reading today, that's spewed out by people that is whoever's the most influential person in culture is winning. It has the loudest voice. I think we talked about that last night. They're not speaking a lot of biblical worldview. They're speaking from a place of secular worldview. So, last bit, and then we're going to open it up to questions, is I just do want to hit on the science stuff because I'm going to show this. It's probably going to show up in your questions. Doesn't science disprove the Bible? Well, what the heck is science in the first place? There's basically two main parts of science: observational science and origin science. So this is not some trick I'm trying to play on you guys. It's like, a little sleight of words from that you got there. So observational science, these are the things we think of like the hard sciences: chemistry, biology, engineering. I was a software engineer. I don't write code anymore, but I know how it works. I work a lot with AI right now, and this is what drew me into this space. I wanted answers in these areas. But know the difference. Observational science is things you can actually see, you can test in a test tube or in a lab, inputs, standard processes, standard outputs. That's what observational science is. But observational science cannot answer questions like, hey, how did the solar system start? Your kids are going to ask that question. I had that question. You can't put that in a test tube and get an answer. Can't answer, hey, how did this huge monolithic thing you can see from space called the Grand Canyon come to be? Or how did all the variation of life that we see on the earth today, how did that come to be? Nobody can tell you from observational science how that happened. People often conflate, though, observational science with what we really need, which is called origin science, or some people call it historical science. So you guys know this. You know, like, hey, if you're at a criminal trial, they're going to use historical or origin science to try to prove what happened in the past, right? They're going to use DNA. There's things they will use to do that. I grew up in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. You may have heard of a big battle that happened there. No one in the town I grew up in actually was alive when the battle happened. Zero. So if we want to try to figure out what happened on those 3 days in July of 1863, we have to go read articles. We have to go read letters. We have to go look at photographs. There's a ton of monuments, if you've ever been there, all over the battlefield that also depict what happened. But that was also at a point in time after the battle happened. So there's still today, even something that happened in 1863, disagreements about exactly precisely what happened, what the generals said, what troop movements happened, and all that. Because no one is alive today that was there. But we do have someone that was alive at the beginning of creation and wrote it down. So think about that. So when we look at those bones, we actually need to be using origin science to think about how to interpret the past and come up with our conclusions. And remember, if you're using any kind of origin science, you're bringing your worldview into your interpretation. And here's I forgot, I lied to you guys, I had one more thing. This one hit me like a ton of bricks, and I may have shared this with some of you before, but in Genesis 1, after the sixth day of creation, God looks around and he says, everything is very good. And then, of course, you guys know what happens in Genesis 2, Genesis 3. Genesis 2, God basically says, hey, if you eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you shall surely die. And then Genesis 3 happens, sin enters the world, right? So we understand this, right? We believe this. Because of man's actions, sin enters the world. All right, buckle up, here you go. So what happens if we believe in an evolutionary millions or billions of years, and we look at the fossil record, and we see disease, death, destruction, animals eating other animals, cancer we see in dinosaur bones, all of that? How is there sin before man? I thought death entered the world because of sin. This was a theological conundrum for me. Now, I want to be super clear, this is not a salvation topic. There's one way that we're saved, and that's through Jesus. But this can cause a lot of issues. Those fourth graders we were teaching, they had these questions, and they were going to get answers. And if we didn't provide those answers that aligned congruently with the Bible, they were going to get a wrong answer and build their house on sand. Okay? So, Now we're going to flip over and see what you guys came up with. And then we'll open up for questions. So start thinking about the questions you all may have. I think I got to pop over here. There we go. Let me pop here. Make it a little bigger for you. All right, so let's see how we're doing. This is a rabid group of people that want to come out and learn on a Saturday, right? So this is a good reason to believe, or there's good reason to believe that the Big Bang Theory is the best explanation for the creation of the universe. And I think we had from strongly disagree to strongly agree. So on the left would be strongly disagree. On the right would be strongly agree. So, we're still answering. Kind of slanted towards strongly disagree, okay? Bunch of people in the middle. The 6 days of creation in Genesis 1 may not be the literal 6 days. Looks like we're pretty evenly spread out with a bunch probably in the middle, like I'm not sure. Radiometric dating, like carbon-14 dating, are good methods to help us understand the age of the Earth. Not really sure. Okay, that's a huge one that's usually thrown out to prove the age of the Earth. Natural selection and random mutation play a big part in creating the variety of the life that we see today. Lots of disagree. Okay. Fossil remains of ape-like creatures like Lucy demonstrate humans evolved from apes or chimpanzees. Lots of disagree. The Bible's account of creation, corruption, sin, catastrophe explain what we observe in the fossil record. Lots of agree, okay. Dinosaurs lived millions of years ago and evolved into birds. Lots of disagree. Hey, you're doing a good job. Dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago from a large natural disaster or disease. A little more variance on this, but slanted towards disagree. And then God blotted out everything. So basically the global flood account on the face of the earth, mostly agree. And Noah's Ark had plenty of room to fit all the animals. Mostly agree. All right. Now you could have taken this too and just said, I think I know what the right answer is supposed to be. But anyway, I'm going to stop it there. That was also just to help try to understand where are we really. And by the way, if you want this survey, I just made it up. I'm happy to, you have the link now. You can just use it if you want with whoever you want. All right. Should flip back over. Oops. Go this way. There we go. All right. So, any of that topic area, let's start thinking about questions, whether it's in the creation space, the Big Bang, evolution, dinosaurs, Lucy, DNA. What do you got? Go for it.
So something I've read regarding Noah's Ark is some people theorize that it wasn't a global flood, it was just localized to the area. What do you think about that?
Great question. Great question. Give me a sec. So I have some slides teed up here. I may have slides, I may not, for some of these questions. Okay. You can throw the slides up, Brian. That'd be cool. But, all right, so here's one of the issues. So first of all, I do believe it was a global flood, and I think there's a lot of evidence to that effect. This is, quote, straight out of Genesis that talks, I think it's Genesis 7, talks about God's promise to us that he will never, ever put a global flood onto the earth to destroy the world. Well, here's one of the theological issues. I was just earlier this week, I was out on a golf course. A lot of you know me. I was playing golf, and I got an alert that said there was a flash flood warning. That was on Wednesday in this area. So do we see floods on the earth today? Yep, right. So if God said he was never going to bring a local flood or a regional flood, this would be incorrect. So I was like, ooh, yeah, that's a thing. Now, I'm not just going to stop there. So that's the theological statement. going to go back here a little bit. All right, so here's what we observe all over the place, and we can dive a lot deeper into this in the rock layer stuff. But we see pancaked layers all over continents, and some of those pancaked layers of sedimentary rock, I know you can't really read it up there, but there's sedimentary rock, especially when you go out west, you can just see it, like in the Grand Canyon, it's super easy to see, and if you go upstream, you can even see it more. But one of those, that yellow one on the right, that's all over the United States, that's the Tapete sandstone deposit that's laid across the continent. And they actually find other rock layers, not only here in the United States, but they actually find them in Europe as well. It's the same exact layer. So what does that mean? How did that get laid down? Everybody agrees it was laid down by water. But the secularist view, the evolutionary view, is that was laid down over millions and millions of years of small particles coming down, and laying it down. The biblical worldview is the global flood happened, and we know the power of water, and I can dive into that further too, that the power of water is crazy, and it can do a lot of damage really fast. And we have evidence that people do ascribe to and believe in that we've actually observed here of that proof. And as it was doing that and washing back and forth, think of tsunamis of just sedimentary rock washing back and forth across the continents, and it's grinding up all kinds of sedimentary material, and then it's dumping it down on top of the continents, and then it's grinding it up and it's dumping it down. I mean, it would have been a scary place. Like it's basically end time stuff, what was happening back then. So in doing so, I actually think that the pancake layers that we see actually prove a lot of the biblical account. Another reason is because when we look at these pancake layers, we don't see erosionary activity through them. You would expect to see a ton of erosionary activity. And what does that look like in a pancake layer? Over millions and millions of years, there's going to be water channels and stuff that form that would actually cut through that rock. We don't see that. We see uniformity. And that shows that that was laid down quickly. It was wet, and then it hardened. Last thing I'll mention is that also is a good proof point for this, and this is blowing a lot of geologists' minds right now. A big article just came out in a scientific journal on this, which is that's a guy up there in the Grand Canyon, and those are rock layers, those pancake layers. So if you can't see, there's a 90-degree fold in those layers. Why is that important? If you can't see it, I'll give you a little hint. There it is. So why? So the secular point of view is this: all these layers were laid down over millions of years. They hardened, and then there was molten lava activity or something, some kind of seismic activity. It heated up the rock, made it more plasticitable, and the seismic activity actually rose the earth up and it caused these flat things to bend. Okay. The biblical worldview is the rock layers were actually wet when they were laid down, so they were already malleable. And then when the seismic activity happened, the same thing happened. They curled up, but they didn't break. And then they hardened in that position. Here's the problem, and why the scientific community is going, is the biblical worldview just makes sense. It just works. Scientifically, it works. But in the secular worldview, the reason it doesn't work is, one, if it was already hardened, and I'll get to the plasticity part. If it was already hardened, what do we know about rock? Think about cement. Like, go out and get the concrete sidewalk. If we try to bend it, what happens? Breaks, right? It's going to fragment. It doesn't bend and fold nicely. The other thing is when, in this case, this is sandstone. When sandstone heats up, so again, the seismic activity, the theory is that it heated up and then it made it more plasticitable, if that's a word, and then it was able to bend. Sandstone actually turns into slate. It actually changes its chemical composition. And so we've actually taken rocks out of here. This is what was in the journal. It took rocks out of here, and then it proved that it was still sandstone. I was like, okay, pretty good. So that had to be laid down quickly, and it had to be wet when it changed. And there's all kinds of folds like this that we can observe in lots of different places. So, did that answer your question? What else?
That was a great answer. And the only other thing I'd add, too, is that there's a ton of history provided that cultures from all different places have a flood story. So just when you look at, like, cultures from that, way back when, or just historical things being written down, If you trace it back, it's just you get evidence of the fact that people from different places are giving some sort of account or have their own version of a flood story. And that just gives us at least an indication that there's something in the minds of people from all sorts of places of some flood thing that happened that they're communicating through their culture, which just adds to this. This is way better evidence than that, but it adds on top of that to say it must have been something that happened to lots of places for this to get kind of passed down in different people groups.
So sorry. I'm going to be that person to ask this. Did dinosaurs exist? Because I know there's a bunch of theories regarding the flood. And if they didn't, where do the fossils come from?
Good question. All right.
You got slides for everything.
I tried,
This is
man.
amazing.
All right, so
I need
dinosaurs.
to carry you with me everywhere I go. Like, you have a slide for that? You have a slide for that
trying.
question?
The short answer is dinosaurs, yes, they existed. I remember we had a teacher one time of our kids at a church, and they asked me that question. They were like, what do we say about dinosaurs? I'm not sure. I'm like, they existed. Like, we have their bones all over the place. Like, yes, they existed. But I understood where that person was coming from. They were coming from a place of being conflicted and wasn't sure how to answer that because they basically had two sides of the story. So I want to go to the Bible first. So in Job actually shares that, behold, now Behemoth eats grass like an ox, right? Has a tail like a cedar. His bones are strong pieces of brass. His bones are like bars of iron. He is the chief of the ways of God. All right, so here's what seculars say about this passage. There's like, oh, well, Job was, 1800 BC or roughly or so was written, one of the oldest books in the Bible. So we can't be that far in an evolutionary time scale from the animals that we see today, so that must have been an elephant. A tail that swings like a cedar. That looks ridiculous. How about a hippo? They say that too. Looks ridiculous. How about a brontosaurus? Makes sense. Similar to the flood stories, there's also tons of stories from different cultures around the earth and pictures, like pictograms that we see on caves and stuff that we've discovered of things that look like dragons or like large creatures that we do not observe today. So that's also an indicator that points at it. The other thing to note is dinosaurs, the word did not come into existence until the mid-1800s. So some people actually will say things like, well, the Bible doesn't mention dinosaurs, and you probably heard me say this before, but it's like, yeah, the Bible also doesn't have the word email or Twitter in it, or X, whatever we're going to call it. There's a reason for that. The word just didn't exist yet. So there's really good reason to believe it is. And then furthermore, we have all the bones and stuff like that. But to give you a little bit of confidence that we actually don't have to believe that it happened 65 million years ago and they all died out. This is from a secular scientist, so I think that also adds credence to it. This is also published in a peer-reviewed journal that they discovered, this is probably like 5 or 6 years ago, they discovered dinosaur tissue inside the bones that actually still had red blood cells they could observe. And you can get on YouTube and watch videos of this. And then they applied a little bit of water to some of the material, and then they got whatever they call this, like tweezers or something. And they're actually able to pull on the organic material, and it actually retracted back. It had elasticity in it. And it blew their mind because pretty much all scientists, whether they have a biblical creation mindset or they're secular, they don't believe that organic material can survive past 100,000 years in the best of the best of the best conditions, which this wouldn't have been in. So that kind of blew their mind. We're like, hey, we got to come up with a new theory now. Get this. This is what they're doing. They're going, well, this doesn't fit our 65 million years ago. They all died. So now we have to come up with a new theory of how it survived 65 million years when they already all agreed that it's just not possible. It's not biologically possible to do that. So there's really good reason to believe that. And then the last things I would just say is that, hey, the dinosaurs, they came into being on day 5, day 6. Mainly day 6 is how we think of it as the land-dwelling ones. But here's what I believe. I believe they lived among us. I believe they were on the ark. I believe for lots of reasons they didn't survive much past the days of Noah, probably because there was a massive worldwide ice age, and they're cold-blooded, so there's lots of issues with them surviving that. But we actually do have this is a archaeological piece that was found down in Texas and is inside of, there's a creation museum in Texas. And it actually shows, it's a little hard to see, but if you look in the top right-hand corner, you're going to see a human footprint up there alongside of a dinosaur footprint. And this was found in a stream bed where there's lots of other dinosaur footprint activity they extracted. And they have done sort of an X-ray, I'm not an expert at this, but an X-ray kind of analysis to demonstrate there was actual real pressure there. Someone didn't fake this, because there's been lots of claims that it was faked to just prove a point that, and make something up to confirm, a biblical account. So, yeah, I believe Noah was hanging out with dinosaurs, and they were on the ark. And if you want to talk more about that, we can do that too. Any other questions in that space?
How come they all extinct? Like, so they don't exist anymore? And I know with some of them, like the carbon, I can't say the word, the ones who eat meat,
Yep.
I heard that they're dangerous. So how could they like abide among us without harming us?
I don't believe they abided or were among us and didn't necessarily harm us. Just like a bison could have run over anybody. I think if you messed with a T-Rex, it's probably a bad idea. So that's one. And then what was the other part of your question?
How come they don't exist
Don't
anymore?
exist. So I believe they don't exist largely, just like other animals we don't see anymore, and they've gone extinct. Like the saber-toothed tiger is an example of that. The woolly mammoth is an example of that. I believe largely it was because after the Noahic flood, global flood, there was a massive ice age, which I think explains a lot of the glaciation that we see today, the scarring on the earth that we see today as a result of that, some of the other catastrophic activity that we do have evidence of today. The Grand Canyon's one of those, that they just weren't suited for that climate anymore to make it. Could be a host of other reasons too. The main thing is I'm interpreting right now. I can't put this in an observational science test tube and prove it to you. But I can look at the evidence that we do see, and that's an explanation, I think, that makes a lot of sense to me, at least.
So I have a few questions. But the Ice Age, I kind of want to start there. How do you think through that? How long do you think it lasted?
Yep.
Man would have had to survive that. How do
Yep.
you walk me through that one.
Yeah, let's start with that, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions around that.
Yeah.
So the Ice Age probably left some of the biggest pieces of evidence geologically that we see across the entire world. And so if you think about, now I'm just going to appeal to your logic right now. If you think about how an Ice Age could come about. So the secular worldview is there's been many ice ages over billions of years. And how that comes about is typically the axis of the earth tilts a little bit further away for a period of hundreds or thousands of years from the sun, and therefore the poles get a little bit colder, and therefore, poof, it's going to create an ice age. And when I first heard that, I was like, oh, that makes sense. It's going to get colder. There's going to be more snow. There's going to be more whatever. So here's where it broke down, to have huge glaciers, which literally they were miles thick, and that's miles thick of compacted snow that turns into ice. So you would literally need tens of miles of snow have dumped in a relatively short period of time, over like maybe a few hundred years max, to create the level of glaciation that we see that actually poured all the way down to basically the middle of the current United States. There's glaciers all the way down like into Kentucky, Ohio, all the way through most of Pennsylvania, so on and so forth. So I think that, or back to the logic, is to do that you have to create a ton of water vapor in the air. That's the only way we get snow, right? Again, appealing to your logic. So basically, where do we get water vapor from? The oceans. We know this, right? You see this all the time in the weather. Up comes water vapor, it goes over the continents need to be cool, and then they dump. And then they do it again and again and again. And this process is repeating itself for hundreds and hundreds of years. The key is you have to have warm water first. If you had a pole that just shifted, everything's getting cooler, including the water. So what is going to create the disparity between the hot water and the cool continents? The flood. The flood was a catastrophic process where there was tons and tons of seismic activity spewing all kinds of molten lava out into the waters. It would have been, I'm telling you, it was crazy. And I think it warmed up the waters tremendously. And water is a very good it's a isolator of heat or whatever. Like it takes a lot of energy to cool it up or heat it up or cool it down. So I think it would have retained a lot of the heat for a long period of time. And that disparity in temperature, and also think of all the aerosols that would have been thrown off by volcanoes and all kinds of crazy stuff that would have actually clouded the atmosphere, that would have cooled down the Earth's temperature at the surface level, which would cool down the temperature of the continents and stuff in any of the things up in the air, which is where the evaporation hits. So I think because of that, that's the best explanation of how we got the massive amount of snow that we needed to get the massive glaciers that we see the evidence of today. Does that make sense?
100%. Would that have covered the whole Earth or just parts of?
Parts of.
Okay, that
so
makes
like
sense.
even in the Bible, we see like the Israel, for instance, looked very different 4,000 years ago, or like in David's time, much more lush, a lot less arid. There was snow caps up on the mountains towards the north, especially. Because it was just a very different climate. Like there's lions and tigers and bears and all kinds of stuff that we hear about in the Bible that we don't see as much today, because now we kind of think of Israel as much like a desert.
Right.
So a lot of the climate has changed pretty rapidly. I mean, the sea levels were actually 200 to 300 feet lower back then. Massive land bridges were opened up. That's what explains a lot of the migration of people and animals. And I mean, we can model it today. We can just lower the sea levels by 200 to 300 feet, and you can actually see where all the land bridges emerge.
So that was my next question. So how do you think through Pangea? Well, so the Ice Age makes a lot of sense, actually. Mm-hmm. That would have created the tectonic plates from shifting in it. That makes a lot of sense, because I was trying to think through how animals would have distributed. But that is probably how that would have happened.
Yeah,
walk me through just.
So Pangea, I think Pangea was, here's the short answer. No one knows. No one was there to see it, right? Except for God. But
can you define Pangea for the audience real quick?
Good question. So Pangea would be basically a singularity of a continent. And that some people, when you look at the continents and you start piecing them back together, you can kind of see like, oh, Russia or Alaska kind of fits into like a Russia right now. And there's parts of like South America could kind of tuck into Africa, and so on and so forth. So then the thought process is that those continents have moved out. The secular point of view is those continents have moved out on the continental drift. If you've ever heard of the continental divide, it's basically moving at like centimeters a year, pushing further and further away from each other. So the idea is that they started all together and they broke up and moved. I believe that that's fairly, there's a good explanation with the global flood event, that if there was a Pangea at that point in time, and that's where Eden was and all that it did break up. We do see, I think, I'm going to get it wrong, you might know it, Psalm 104, I think, talks about the mountains basically soaring up in the, like we see the Mariana Trench, we see the Himalayas. The Himalayas are actually early mountains. And so we see the seismic activity that caused them to shoot up. We actually have evidence of marine fossils at 15,000 feet in the Himalayas.
Right.
How'd that get there? Right? So, so that's how I think what probably happened is the flood account and the tectonic activity at the time explains the massive change that we see in the earth. And it was very different before than it is today.
And to confirm, an ice age creates enough tectonic activity to also create land bridges and shifts. They're one and the same?
I wouldn't call them tectonic activity from a ice age.
Okay.
I would just call that, it basically, there was so much water, like we know how, basically by looking at the scarring of the earth and what we can see geologically today in the evidence, we can basically understand how high these glaciers had to be, and then we can understand how much water actually had to come out of the oceans to dump on top.
That makes sense.
And so then we can actually model how much lower the oceans had to be all the way back then.
Oh, that's cool. Okay.
Yeah.
I think.
Yep.
Few more minutes. Any other quick? Okay.
We obviously have lots of parents in the room, lots of people that work with kids. Our kids are going to love dinosaurs. Our kids are going to go to public schools. as a parent yourself of two, what does that look like of what you focus on with them? Obviously the Bible, but what other resources, what things do you point to as they ask these questions?
Great question, Val. So my wife over here homeschools our
Yeah,
kids.
Missy, maybe you should answer.
All this stuff was a part of that decision for us, for what it's worth. But we do use the opportunity we look at education as a way to glorify and worship God in our education. So one of those things that we just, again, appealing to your logic, we live in a very orderly world, very orderly. You throw a ball up, it comes down. You do math, 2 + 2 always equals 4. You just go down the line. The sun comes up in the morning, it goes down. We can predict when the next solar eclipse is going to be. We saw the solar eclipse. It's flipping amazing. It was a worship event. When we did and all of those things, whether teaching math, we're going to see the solar eclipse, we're talking about it from the lens of God made this. God made math orderly so that we could actually use it for our good. Because everything that comes from God for us is good. So that's how we use everything we do. We don't say math was a random mutation or some random chance thing happened in a chaotic world. And like I have an atheist friend and he's just like, well, just because it is, therefore it is. And it's like it exists, so therefore. I'm like, but the fingerprints of design are everywhere. Everywhere. When you add up the totality and the impossibility of all of that stuff, it's crazy. So that's how we show up and we do it. And I'll just put a plug in. Like I really believe, I'm very, very opinionated about this because I think the Bible's very opinionated about this. That is the primary responsibility of parents to teach their children. I'm not saying that because that means you have to go homeschool your kids. That's not my point. My point is there's tons of people that send their kids to public school. But if they spend 8 hours a day getting taught secular worldview, guess what they're predominantly going to walk out of after 14, 15 years of that education system. So you have to spend, I believe, a lot of time on the back end, I don't want to say untraining them, but training them under a biblical worldview so they don't try to plant their Christian worldview on top of man's word. Oh, yeah, and those resources I showed up front are...
Give her a mic, yeah, you can tell us.
Yes. Oh, sorry, y'all. So yeah, if you have questions specific about certain resources, I have a problem at our household because we homeschool. I love resources. And so there are certain ministries that exist that, perfect. Answers in Genesis, master books, where there are books about dinosaurs and the flood. I mean, just basically all of these things written at a kid's level from a creationist and biblical worldview. So that's their ministry. And so there's lots of resources that are geared towards kids at all different levels, where we can actually talk and teach about dinosaurs and learn ourselves, because that's what we were doing, was like, I'm going to learn alongside you as we're reading some of these things. But I didn't bring any of them today. But so if you have specific questions, I can share lots of fun resources and videos.
Random thought, we could make a list and put it on the website under the resources tab if you already have it, and then they'll just make it available. So if we just make a PDF or something,
that's a good one.
We can make that easily available for you. So any other questions before we take a little lunch break? Well, I think we have till 11:30. I don't know where Grace is. I forget how long we have on this. Go ahead.
Okay, so I just wanted to ask about, you had a question in the survey about the 6 days, and I was curious about, is the time frame different? Like, our day for us is 24 hours. Like, what did that look like back then? Or do you have any information?
I have lots of thoughts about that one.
Yeah, there's a slide for this.
All right, so I see you create the survey, Nate, and then you just build slides to the survey. All right, so let's hit this first. Is like a lot of the whole, hey, not 24-hour day. Where did that come from? Did it come from the Bible? And I'm going to prove it to you. So let's talk day. So day can mean a lot of things. It could be back in my father's day. It took 10 days to drive across Australia or the outback during the day. So here's some literary context. So I'm not a Hebraist, but there's lots of them out there. And if you look outside of Genesis 1, Genesis 1 is the only place where there's conflict, if you will, in the world about what the word day means, or the Hebrew word is yom. That anytime the word day or something like it is used outside, and I'm going to have a foot stomp here, it's 410 times. Day is used with the number outside of Genesis 1. 38 times evening and morning together without day, but that basically means a 24-hour day. 23 times evening and morning is used together with day, and then 52 times night is used with day. Every time we see that happen, I know it's getting cut off a little bit, but it says that always means one ordinary 24-hour day. Everywhere throughout the Bible when those instances show up. Check this out. So, this is Genesis 1. Night, evening, morning, first day. Evening, morning, second day. Evening, morning, third day. So on and so forth. 19 different times it puts those things into context. They only have to exist one together. Like that first one, there's 4. So it's more or less like God was saying, I meant this was a day. So the literary context says that Hebraists agree that it's one literal day. It's also considered historical narrative, Genesis 1. Some people try to posit that it's actually poetry or some kind of allegorical kind of thing. Hebraists also agree that it's narrative, so therefore literal is its intended purpose of how to interpret it. So let me just hit a few other things here. Oh, I did want to hit this because Scripture is good. If you fast forward into Exodus, and we're talking about the commandment about keep the Sabbath holy, it goes on to clarify that it says, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and the sea and all that is in them, so on and so forth. So you have to ignore that when you get to that, because that's also narrative, historical narrative. That's to be taken literal. So you'd have to come up with some other explanation for that. So what folks have done, and again, this is man's word coming into the Bible. They're trying to inject man's philosophies in there. Is like, where do you put the millions of years or billions of years? You either have to use like the gap theory, the day-age theory, and you have to start putting, like, maybe there was billions of years before man showed up. But now we already talked about the theological issue with that, because then you have death, disease, and destruction before sin. Sin is what brought death into the world theologically, right? So maybe you put millions of years in between each day, or maybe each day is millions of years. Well, I don't think that's the case, and here's another issue with that. If you look at day 4, there's a sun and a moon. The sun, the moon, and the stars came into existence on day 4, okay? How the heck did the land and all the seed-bearing fruit and trees and plants come into existence before the sun, moon, and the stars, and then exist for millions and millions of years without sun, moon, and stars? It doesn't work. It just doesn't work. So I think when it comes down to it, that's man's word trying to get injected into God's word, and they just do not work together. So that's kind of how I think about it.
You know, one of my favorite things about understanding old or young Earth, in terms of, because that's all these discussions turn into, you know, is you have to deal with the days because you're concerned about how old the Earth is, you know. So how does that work? And this is just a very simple way. There's imagine like so we're testing things and we say, well, the Earth has to be this old. So how old was Adam on the first day he was there? How old was he? How old was he? A day old. How old did he look? If you looked at him and observed him scientifically, you can get how old you think he'd guess. 25, 30. If you looked at him, you say, that's a 25-year-old man. Now, let's say the first tree, very tall, it's there. You test it. You look at how many rings it has. You'd say, how old do you think that tree is? How old was it? It's a day. If you observe it scientifically, how old did it look? It's super old, you know? So if God creates everything at one time, and then it looks fully formed, the way we would observe it as a human is to say, well, that's much older than it looks, because we're going to use our methods. But Adam was 1 day old. He looks 25. You know, the tree is 1 day old. It looks millions of years based off how many rings it has. So it helps me at least to say, that makes a lot of sense. If everything's created at once, if I look at it, it's going to look a lot older than I think. So it's almost like you're both right. If I observe it scientifically, yeah, that's how old that tree would have to be. But if I understand the creation account to say, well, in 1 day it looked millions of years old. So, okay, that kind of helps me grab on. It logically makes sense to say the earth could look 25 million years, whatever, 65 million. It could look that old the way I look at it, but it could also be 6,000 years old or whatever, 6 to 10,000 years old. since God made it all at first look fully formed. So that helps me think through. Then I can just take all of that literally and apply and put it into that context. And it kind of helps me say, oh, that makes sense to me, you know.
Yeah, I want to just, we're on the last minute here. This is a brand new one I get super pumped about. I just wanted to show to you guys. So the James Webb Telescope, it was basically the replacement for the Hubble telescope, was thrown up into outer space about a year ago. It was a big deal. Its purpose and intent was to look into deep space. So I got this off NASA's website. This is what they say, is that it can look 13.5 billion light years away. That's the infrared that it can observe. It's kind of like it's unfathomable, really, if you think about it. All right, cool. So their hypothesis was that we're going to, if we had a Big Bang, everything moved out from there, we can look in the outer reaches of what happened. So we should be seeing basically early history, early Big Bang history. Does that make sense? 13.5 billion years ago. So here was the unexpected discovery, was that they've actually observed mature galaxy formation way out. I don't know how many billions of years out. I don't know if it was 13.5, but the furthest they've seen, they've actually seen mature galaxies formed out there. They were expecting to see early formation, which right after the Big Bang, it's theorized that there was just like helium and hydrogen clouds that should be floating about. And they're expecting to see that, and they didn't. And it baffled them. So I actually think this is a really exciting one where it's actually proving that even with a massive expanse that we have of a universe, it actually is young. And our taxpayer dollars paid billions of dollars to learn that. So good job. I can dive into Big Bang, but it is past 11:30.
How about we do this? We'll open it up for lunch. Grace, are we ready for lunch? Go ahead and grab your lunch, and you can keep asking Clinton questions. He'll eat lunch last, okay? So let me pray. We'll bless it, and then go get your lunch. But we'll use the mic. We'll just keep talking, and you can listen if you want or eat if you want. All right. So let me pray. Okay, Lord, we love you. Thank you. Thank you once again, Lord, that we have good reasons to believe the truth of your word. It should be enough, your word, but you've also given us all these wonderful realities in the earth. I pray once again that you would firm up our faith in you. Thank you for Clinton and, Lord, and all that you've blessed him with this knowledge. Thank you for his time together with us. Thank you for the food. And I pray you would continue, Lord, just to bless this day. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, go to the lobby, get some lunch, and Clinton will talk to Austin. And if you want to listen to him talk to Austin, you can do that. Okay, great.
All right. Big Bang. I'm not an astronomer, but I'll just say this. One thing I always hate in our current culture is like, well, are you an astronomer? Are you a geologist? Like, no, but I have logic and reasoning that God gave to me, and everything's consistent and orderly, so I'm not dumb, right? And I believe that about all of us. We're all created in the image of God. Like, we can use our logic, so Big Bang. All right, so let's just first define what the theory of Big Bang is. Again, it's just a story, really, at the end of the day. But first, there was something, they actually caused this, by the way. It wasn't called Big Bang originally. It was called the cosmic egg, like theory or something like that. What basically was there's a ball of energy, no mass anywhere, so no material, anything, just energy. And then all of a sudden it exploded, so there's some reason that it exploded 13.7 billion years ago. And then from that, the thought is over billions of years, you have helium and hydrogen clouds that form out of that. That's basically the matter that was created out of the Big Bang. So it turned energy into matter, and that was the matter. And then over about 10 to 12 billion years, those clouds started to kind of come together, and gravitational forces started pulling together. You got more gravitational force, so on and so forth, started sucking things together, and then a star formed. Okay, and then in the star formation, process, it's actually creating heavier elements. So hydrogen and helium are 1 and 2 on the periodic table, so they're the lightest elements. But if we look around our observable world, it's not just all helium and hydrogen, right? There's all kinds of other elements on the periodic table that we observe. So how the heck did those come into being? The explanation for that is they're actually made in the core of stars. So whatever nuclear process is happening in a crazy star, it's super hot and all the things, it's creating denser and denser elements. And then a supernova is actually when a star dies and it explodes. We've actually observed this. We've actually seen dead stars blow up, and a tremendous amount of energy. I just read this morning, that more energy is given off for a dying star when it explodes than the sun has its entire life. Think about that. But anyway, what does that do? It sprays out into the universe all these heavier elements that then get sucked into gravitational force fields of other stars that then get sucked in, and then the process repeats itself. That's why it says recycle up there. And then you get denser and denser and things. So this process is repeating itself over billions and billions of years. And then eventually our solar system comes along about 5 billion years ago. So that's basically the theory of how it works. So what are some of the problems with that? First and foremost, I would submit, because I used to think the Big Bang was a thing. I was like, this is how it all worked. That it removes God from the equation. The Big Bang theory fundamentally relies on naturalism and uniformitarianism. I have not defined for you guys uniformitarianism. I have a whole set on that. But those are the two driving philosophies for it. At a high level, uniformitarianism says we can only use current present processes that we see and the rate of change of those said present processes that we see today. So like the half-life of an atom. It takes 5,000 years roughly for carbon to decay into nitrogen and still some carbon left over. Cool. You can only use that as when you run the tape backwards to figure out, how much carbon there was years ago. Point is, present processes, present rates of change are used to predict the past only. That's what uniformitarianism is. That's not a godly thing. Anyway, there's no God in any of this, so it's actually an atheistic point of view. Second, it doesn't support the 7 days worldview we just talked about, so I don't need to go over that. And then the last one here is the stars before Earth. I actually already went over that. So that the stars would have formed forever, it's actually incongruent with what we see in the 6 days of creation and the order that we see it in. What are some of the more scientific problems? All right, so first, no one talks anymore about the cosmic egg. What caused this ball of energy that's theorized to be there? What caused it in the first place? Missy and I watched this Discovery Channel, it's like a 2-hour special that had Stephen Hawking in it, and it basically was explaining the Big Bang Theory. You can go watch it. I'd encourage you all to almost watch it just to see what happens at the end, but I'm going to, spoiler alert, just give it away. It goes all the way back, and Stephen Hawking's like, we now know where the singularity came from and how the entire universe was created. It was a singularity ball of energy, and then basically the film ends. And Missy and I are like, ask the next flipping question. Where did the energy come from? What caused it to explode? Nothing. Crickets. And it was like, you're so wound around this ideology that you can't, that spider monkey grip, you can't let go of it. You can't let go of it. So I actually thought at the end, I was like, well, this is unexplainable. So that was one bit. There's no origins there. Here's another one that is a massive problem. Origins of the first stars. We've seen stars die. We've never seen one born, ever. So we've seen many stars die out, never one born. Why? My belief is that because God created the stars on day 4, which was roughly about 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. So, we've never need to see another one because he created them all then. So that's a problem. Because the theory is that all these stars were born, and then they are the ones that were basically the manufacturing process to create heavy elements, and we wouldn't have all the non-helium, non-hydrogen elements, which is a vast majority of our world, without it, including oxygen that we're breathing right now. Antimatter is a problem. The high level on this, I don't know too much about this, but this from observational science, if you actually run experiments in some of the space, is that if you create matter out of energy, you can create matter from just energy. However, it also creates something called antimatter. And so you should have equal amounts antimatter created as matter. We see only trace amounts of antimatter in the world or in the universe. That's a massive problem because we should see equal, but we don't. So that's the major one, outside of this one that I already shared. Yeah. Yeah, one of the things we see is the red shift. So the red shift, if you're not familiar with it, there's red and blue shifts of light. So they call it the Doppler effect. So you're familiar with this. If you hear a siren like from a police car coming towards you, it actually gets louder, like higher pitched sound as it's coming towards you. And as it goes away, it's actually longer or lower pitched sounds. That's because as it's coming towards you, it's actually shorter wavelengths coming at you. As it's going away from you, it's longer wavelengths. So higher pitch, lower pitch. The same thing happens in light wavelength. If an object in space is coming towards you, it actually emits bluer light on the spectrum of light. The opposite end, if you're familiar with the light spectrum, is red light. If it's moving away from you, it emits a longer wavelength, which is red light. So we do see that. Like, there's nothing wrong with us as Christians to say we observationally see red wavelengths. The red shift is what it's called. And that means there are things in the atmosphere moving away from us. By the way, we also see blue shifts. There are things coming towards us in the atmosphere too. But I don't think there's no incongruent or contradictory thinking there. Yeah. Yeah, Drew. I do. You haven't, huh? So there's a lot. Evolution's such a big topic. So let me.
So how would you disprove it in like your
One, I would just say, because everybody's fairly familiar with natural selection, random mutation, I would just go back to I'll just show you the money slide, man. Let me find it, dude. This is one of them. So basically, one of them is Darwin said this. He wrote it down in his book because he was positing a brand new way of thinking, right? So he was also, I'd say, trying to be somewhat intellectually honest and saying, this is what I think, but this is how you would disprove it if you don't. And he basically said, look, if we don't find in the fossil record transitional fossils that actually are transitional, they're not loose. I can talk about Lucy if you want. But then my theory, he says, I can give no satisfactory answer. Sorry, this is a different one. My bad, dude. This is about the Cambrian explosion, where basically we see a whole fossil record where it's just poof, all of a sudden there's nothing and there's a ton of life. And he says, I can't explain it. Somewhere else, I have it in a different slide, he says that basically if we don't see these transitional species in the fossil record, and we don't, people have lots of theories. They're like, well, I see a bird and I see a dinosaur. That became that. Where's the transitional species in between? Oh, you don't have it. And they'll come up with some, and you'll be like, okay, that's a bird, dude. Or that's a dinosaur. That didn't become that. So that's probably a really big one. I personally think DNA that one's so discrete and it's so observable today. Darwin had zero insight into that. He didn't have a microscope, and he wasn't even a biologist, right? I think that's a really good one. So if I had to hit that, trying to figure out what's the easiest one just to say this. I'll just start here. First off, if you know anything about DNA, and I'm not a molecular biologist, but it's basically a string of A, C, T's, and G's. And that makes up, I think, a chromosome or something like that. I might be wrong on that. But point of it is there's like 3 billion of them in your genome. Whenever you look at that, it actually reads like computer code. I'm a software developer, so I was like, dude, now, I'm listening. And it actually is coded to actually give you the brown hair that you have, the brown eyes that you have, the height that you have, everything. By the way, you had all of that when you were born. And more so, you had all of it when you were born to actually carry, it had the entire instruction set for when you were born to actually have you go through all the different developmental stages throughout your entire life. In the very first set of DNA that happened at conception. That's crazy. And then what it can do, so by the way, information always comes from an intelligent mind, never comes from random chance. I'll get back into that. I just mentioned this. And here's what it does, all the instruction set thing. It's like an iPhone dropped out of the sky and had all the instruction set to create more iPhones and more iPhones. And that begs the question, what created the first one? How the heck did that DNA come into place in the first place that reads like computer code? I'll come back to the monkeys maybe. But I'm going to hit this last one here, Drew, because it kind of gets down to this is another really good one. This is a naturalistic philosopher, not a biblical thinking, believing person. And this is what he says about this DNA stuff. It says, what makes the origin of life and of the genetic code a disturbing riddle is this. The genetic code is without any biological function unless it is translated. So I write code as a developer. I need a compiler to actually understand and translate the code I wrote to actually run and function, right? So if you're kind of following that analogy. So the machinery by which the cell translates the code consists of at least 50 macromolecular components which are themselves coded in the DNA. And I'll kind of translate some of this for you guys. Thus, the code cannot be translated except by using certain products of its translation. Hey, what does that mean at the end of the day? You need both the code and the translator is all in the DNA. You couldn't have the code and then evolve the translation, or the translation and then evolve the code. You had to have them both at the same time. It's a chicken and egg problem. So irreducible complexity is a little different, but it's in the ballpark, Austin. So irreducible complexity is another great one. Again, I'm just saying these words, go look them up. But irreducible complexity is basically a system that everything has to come together. There's parts to it that have to come together for that thing to work. And the key thing is the step-by-step change. The evolutionary thinking is that things evolve step by step by step. They get a little bit more complex, a little bit more complex, a little bit more complex. And then eventually something new comes up, right? Well, irreducible complexity is like this mousetrap here, where if we take any one of those parts away, the mousetrap does not work. It can't exist. It won't come together. So they all have to exist all at the same time to come together. Where we see this in biology is we see that in something called the bacterial flagellum. That's actually the most widely used one. It's just a little tail that's behind bacteria that helps it move around. We can see this under microscopes. Darwin didn't have access to any of this stuff. And it's considered the most efficient machine in the world. It moves at like 8 to 10,000 RPMs. It's crazy. But it's irreducible complex. If you took away some of its component parts, you wouldn't have it. It would not exist. The eye is another baffling one. That came onto the scene actually in the Cambrian explosion, and no one understands why or how it came to be. It just happened. This one, to me, I put this in here because I thought it was simple, this arched foot. We all have arched feet. Think about if you tried to build the thing up from the bottom up and you were doing the step-by-step linear evolutionary process. It would never build. It would fall down. How did that come to be? That makes no sense at all. The last thing I'll say on random mutation is the biggest problem as far as the theory of evolution. So I'll just go back to that, which is natural selection makes a lot of sense to me within a kind. Dogs, we see it. Like we literally observe natural selection, right? So there's no issues with that. Random mutation is where we have issues. So the idea that DNA will actually mutate to get more complex is completely bogus. Again, Darwin didn't know about DNA. What we see in mutation is we see a loss of information. we see a mutation of the actual DNA structure and we lose some of those A, C, T's, and G's. It gets less complex, not the opposite direction. That's the second law of thermodynamics in play. It's a law, a natural law. Things will not get more complex absent external energy in a system. So that's a massive, massive problem that's in the DNA space, but it is totally linked to evolutionary thinking. And by the way, one last bit on that is I actually also think that's what explains the super long ages that we see in the genealogies pre-flood. I actually do believe that we are degrading in our DNA structure as we age and age and age. We just have more technology than they had back then. It's helping to aid and support our degradation. Yeah, first, it's how did it come into existence in the first place? Then assume that for, like, to me, the greatest miracle in the world is that God created the heavens and the earth. Something from nothing. Second one is life happens. Explain that. And I've got other stuff on that if you want. And then you get into DNA. It's like, how did even the concept of DNA in a completely random, chance, chaotic world, this super, I mean, it's more complex than any computer software thing we've ever written in the history of the world combined. And it's durable, it replicates itself. Like we've never built something, even with all the AI stuff going on, and I'm doing a ton of AI stuff at work. There's a human designer behind all of that. It's just got the fingerprints of design on it. So, and by the way, like one of the examples sometimes people use is like, hey, I can take the parts, like how did life come about? I can take the parts of a flashlight, take it all apart, throw it in a paper bag, and I can sit here and shake it for the next like billion years. Guess what's never going to happen? It's going to turn into a flashlight again. There's actually been studies, well not studies, experiments done where they're trying to create life, and they've actually took all the component parts out of a live cell. So they had all the building blocks they needed necessary for life. And they tried to zap it with electricity, do all these things. They've never, ever, ever, ever been able to create one single cell organism that was alive. They've been able to create RNA. RNA is a building block to, what's it called? Not the thing before proteins. Amino acids, which are building blocks to proteins, which are building blocks to actual pieces of the molecular structures in cells. But the crazy thing is that it was like a famous experiment in 1953 called the Miller experiment. They zapped some primordial soup hypothesized to be in existence back at the beginning of the Earth, and they zapped it with electricity, and they actually produced some like RNA scum. The interesting part of that was when RNA is created, there's two different kinds of RNA, and this is where I break down, I don't understand below this, but they say there's like, they call left-handed RNA and right-handed RNA. The left-handed RNA is basically the RNA that's created for the building blocks for living things. The right-handed RNA is the RNA that's created in the decomposition of things that are dead. They created the right-handed one. They essentially proved death and not life. But how is it marketed to the world? We've discovered how to create the building blocks of life. Therefore, it's possible. So the possibilities are stupid. All right, I'll give you my last one in this space. If you've ever heard this, someone might throw it at you, is just give it enough time and the randomness will work itself out and things will come together. So one of the examples people have used is that, hey, if you get a bunch of monkeys together and give them a typewriter, eventually they'll write the works, a work of Shakespeare, Hamlet, whatever. Okay, really? Let's try that out for a second. So there's 64 keys on a keyboard if you count the caps lock and you count like all caps and lower caps, spacebar, punctuation. Just to create the right first 5 characters, the chances of that happening are like 1 in a billion. The first 5 characters. To create 50, it's almost a Google. A Google is 1 with 100 zeros behind it. I calculated this because the average is actually about 22,600 words, about 100,000 characters. There's some really big number calculators out there. I couldn't even figure out, I literally kept it out of the slides because I couldn't figure out how to convey the size of the number. It's so huge. Like I just couldn't even, there was no comprehensible way to put it on here and quantify how big that number was. I couldn't say 10 to the whatever, like, because that whatever was like pages of numbers long. So that just, in my opinion, it gives you an insight into how ridiculous chance and time is in the theory of evolution. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I should say what we molecularly see is this on the right. We observe this. Darwin's evolutionary theory, really the story he came up with based on his worldview, which is on the left. What scientists observe in observational science is what's on the right. So DNA is like this, I think it's a huge thing that's going to basically be a massive confirmation for biblical worldview. So there's a lot of things in the scientific community right now, people trying to come up with different explanations. So it's funny, instead of just saying, well, let's just follow the evidence, and they're interpreting and saying, how do we explain this in millions or billions of years now that this is what we're seeing? Do you see what they're doing there? It's all worldview. So, Adrian?
I was wondering, going back to you said you watched that documentary, right, about the origin of life, and they ended by saying it was a ball of energy that exploded. So, just curious, I guess, in the secular realm and like in the scientific community in general, do you know, I guess, is there more, because a ball of energy that's always been there sounds a lot like God, except add personal qualities. So do you know, are individuals in the scientific community, and specifically like secular, kind of moving towards any reconciling idea that the concept of a God may be more plausible, I guess, and considering what they now think?
I would say that the secular folks are secular, and their worldview it's completely naturalism and uniformitarianism, which is completely absent supernatural processes. And so I think that they would just generally stay dogmatic about I'm still in the hunt to discover an explanation that's natural. I do believe there's a lot of people on the Christian side, like myself, who grew up thinking that that's how the world was created, and get influenced a ton by the secular point of view. And hopefully I've showed you there's a lot of Swiss cheese in their argument. Like, there's just holes everywhere. But then I tried to wedge all of that into my biblical understanding, albeit very poorly. And so I do believe there's a lot of Christians today that are doing the same thing, and it causes a ton of other theological issues and evidential issues that manifest themselves like people walking away from the church because they don't have any sufficient answers, but they're getting other answers. But a lot of times they don't dive deeper into these things, to be honest. I don't know if that answered your question or not.
It does. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes you hear alien, they're like, well, how did the singularity come about? And they're like, oh, aliens put it there. Okay, how'd the aliens come about? Other aliens. And we're in an infinite loop. It's like, it's just ridiculous. Like, it doesn't make sense absent an creator.
Right. They're trying to fix the problem of the complexity in there, that there had to be a mind behind it, but instead of going to, well, maybe there is a God, we go to maybe there's aliens that came. Right, because the Bible talks about this, where we know the truth, but we deny it. That's what Romans 1 is talking about.
Yeah.
Like, we think we're wise and we become like we're
Being
foolish.
fools, yeah.
Because we're looking for any other reason. Because as long as it's not God, then I don't have to be in submission to Him. So kind of they get to grasping at straws, as we all would, if our worldview was being questioned.
Any other ones? How does AI fit into all of this? So, yeah, I said my background is as a software engineer. I happen to lead a team that is, in my company, is our internal product R&D team that is doing generative AI work. And that's our primary thing. So we actually work directly with some of the large language model folks that are building these massive things out there. It's really hard to keep up with. But it's hard to explain how it all works, and I don't even understand how it all works, but effectively, AI is dependent upon a set of parameters that are tuned for the model itself to work. And that those parameters are defined by intelligent designers called humans. The AI is not training itself. The parameters are human driven. So, ergo, there's no explanation for like true artificial intelligence or general artificial intelligence is what some people call it. That's going to like create itself. There will always be, I believe, a human dependency in the loop at some point. It might get crazier. I think it's going to get crazier for what it's worth, but yeah. So the question is like, as we get more and more information, how do we distinguish truth from error? Read the Bible, I think, is first and foremost, because I actually think that is a massive issue today. It's not probably a new issue, realistically, because we know, as the Bible says, like the devil's the father of lies, so lies have been flowing around the earth since it began. But I would just say, like, we have to have a firm foundation on what biblical truth is. And Missy shared this with me one time, I think she got it out of a book, which was like, if you have a belief about something, name anything, and you can't look to the Bible and understand why you believe that, at some point in your decision logic tree, you may have a flaw. What might be actually underneath of that is a worldview that came from man's word that you learned somewhere in the past. Does that make sense? So I think it's super duper duper important for all of us, totally putting myself in this category, which is we need, like, I'm sometimes jealous of like Nate, where he's just like rattling off scripture straight out of his heart, and he's like, well, there's five things, there's a three-legged stool thing, boom, 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 and here's then scripture, chapter, verse, boom, chapter, verse, boom, chapter, verse, and I'm just like, that's, he's not God, but that God gave us his truth so we could actually discern and understand this world that was designed by his truth. His truth never changes. That's the thing that scares me the most about like the secular world, is it's completely relative and completely changed. It keeps changing. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say one thing about that for the parents here, I heard this and it really resonated with me. Let me find it real quick. Your question or comment was around the flood and children believing it and that kind of stuff. Sorry, I've got, where is this thing? Here it is. We need to stop teaching our children that this is what the ark looked like. It downplays the reality of what's in God's word, of what it actually, like the dimensions of it, makes it look cartoonish, playful, and basically not believable. That's how it's often depicted, even in a lot of Christian books. Here's the deal of the ark. It was like this. It was a ship. So one of the things that I know we do with our kids is if you ask any of my kids, you say like, hey, what was the ark? They'll say a ship. Because these are the dimensions that were laid out in Genesis. I have the reference up there. So if you actually go and look at that, that was about this size. So relative to the largest sailboat ship in the world is bigger than that. You know, it was about, 60% of the size of the Titanic. It was huge. So this was not a small thing. And its job was to float out in deep water. That was its job. It didn't have to steer. It didn't have to have propulsion. It just had to keep everybody inside in a fortress, basically, from the outside. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, I don't see why like science and religion can't like God can use any scientific process, whether it's macroevolution or microevolution or the Big Bang or whatever, to bring about outcomes that God desires. So I'm just curious, when you read the Bible, how do you determine? Because parts of it are definitely psalms and songs and
Yep.
poetry, and some of it is literature, some of it is history, some of it is
Yep.
oral tradition written down, some of it is laws. Like, how do you determine which parts are what to guide your interpretation?
Yeah, good question. Like, how do you interpret what parts of the Bible are poetry or historical narrative or that? I don't rely on myself for that. I'm going to go find a resource outside of me, like a Hebraist or somebody, or read what the consensus is from Hebraist, if we're talking about the Old Testament, to say, like, is this historical narrative? Is this poetry? What is this? I'm definitely not relying on myself. I think that's why we were designed to be in a church, to be in community, so we could actually get a counsel, if you will, of wisdom on a question like that. I do believe there's a lot of folks that have injected incorrectly that Genesis 1, 2, 3, whatever, is not historical narrative, that it is poetry. That's a rabbit hole, and I'm not an expert at that, but that is highly incorrect if you trust what the community of Hebraists would say. Basically, the PhDs of the world on this topic disagree. So if we're going counter to that, then that person is out on an island by themselves. A Hebraist, sorry, good question. A Hebraist is someone that their professional vocation is the study of Hebrew, the language of Hebrew. So they're a foremost expert at that. And its derivatives, whether it be the stuff that came before modern Hebrew or after. Modern being like Bible times. So they typically will look at the Bible, the language of that, let's say Genesis 1, and they'll look at other parts of the Bible and say, hey, this style of writing, how does it compare to this? Like, so lots of people don't have problems with other, like, for instance, Acts. That's New Testament. But Acts, I think everybody would agree Acts is to be taken literal, right? Paul went from here to there to there to there. Stephen really got stoned and died. Paul really met Jesus on the road to Damascus. Paul really gave a speech at Pisidian Antioch. That's not a poetic translation where let's just take some macro interpretation out of it that's not literal. And then, of course, you can go dig stuff up out of the ground and confirm a lot of all those things. So that's also, to me, where it's like a lot of the stuff in Genesis, it's to be taken literal. I think there is a lot of evidence that we can dig up out of the ground or look in the, whether it's the fossil record or the geological record, and we can see these things and be like, yeah, that makes sense. It doesn't make sense from an evolutionary point of view. So I think what the evolutionary point of view is going to do, or the secular point of view, they're always going to be in search of finding something else that's naturalistic and uniformitarianistic, not supernatural, to explain their position, because they just won't afford a supernatural option, even if everything is pointing at it. So, good questions. Yeah.
So, what is your advice for parents now that there's so much information out there, and then there comes the decision, for example, for us, for kids to go to public schools, or not that
Well, you're on
talking
dangerous
about.
ground now.
Yeah, but the possibility of homeschool and how that could be a option for parents that can, but also for parents that can't, because they both have to work, but there's that possibility also. How would you mix up like public school learning to going to school? How would you?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's something that is a massive struggle for a lot of people, especially in this area, especially in the church. At a high level, by the way, if Missy and I have gone down this road, happy to talk to anybody about it. But we're both public school products. Like that, both our moms were teachers in the public school system for over 30 years. So, that's our background. Just so you know where we're coming from. But I believe that if you're a Christian and you send your kids to public school, or I wouldn't even say public school. You send your kid to any school that's not you. The Bible tells you that your job as a parent is to educate your kids, period. It's not somebody else's job. So if you send them to private Christian school, it's still your job to educate them, right? So I do think there's different degrees, though, of depending where you're sending them and where they're learning, because their teacher is not only their teacher. They also have like 27 other kids in their classroom they're learning from. And there's other influences. So if you're putting 8 hours a day into your kid and they're non-secular things, you're probably going to have to spend more time outside of that pumping biblical truth into them and inspecting the things that they've learned to unroll and unpack some of those things potentially and replace it with actual biblical immutable truth. So that's one thing. Two, our entire society, at least in the DC area, I'll just say, seemingly to me, is built around having two-parent incomes. So it becomes very, very difficult, just structurally, the way we're set up. So I think that's just a fact that we have to, acknowledge. I'm not, it'd be great if everybody could figure something out like that. But I would also submit sometimes we use that as an excuse of why we don't train and teach the next generation. Missy could give you a ton of examples, me less so, but of tons of parents that are full-time working parents, working more than one job, that still homeschool their children. And it stretches me where I'm like, I can't believe you do that. I don't know how you do that. But they do, because they've made that a priority for their family and their kids, because they know what their kids are going to grow up with and what they're likely, if you look at statistics, what their likely fate is going to be when they're 18, 19, 20, 21, and the adult choices that they're going to make that may be really detrimental for them. So I think that's everybody's choice how they have to figure it out, but I think there's definitely other options out there for people. And actually, since COVID, it's exploded with a whole bunch of new options out there. So, yeah. And I know we're not the only ones at homeschool here, by the way. There's other people. Any other questions? Trying to find it, Esther. Oh,
Thank you.
There we go. So this is in the you ever heard of irreducible complexity?
Yeah, and I actually, I used to teach anatomy, so I like this slide. I just wanted to know how it related to the concept.
So, and you tell me if I'm wrong, by the way, because I'm not an anatomist. But the idea being that in a keystone, if you align it with a step-by-step evolutionary process where things have to evolve gradually, but in a step order fashion, that if you were to be building up just the thing on the right, the actual, generic keystone structure, that it would basically collapse and fall down. You never get to the keystone. Does that make sense? So, and basically the arch of our foot there's a keystone in it. Yeah. Yep. So how would that come to be? That's the easiest one, in my opinion, to understand. The eye and the flagellum are actually much better examples, in my opinion, but the eye is so complex. Like, I couldn't explain it to you guys. I don't even know where to start. But how did all of those systems, cones and rods and all the things come together to allow us to see? I think there's an answer to it. I think it's pretty straightforward, but there's a lot of the world that, don't want to leave room for it. So, anything else? All right. Well, thank you very much.